Sometimes I feel so sad, watching this generation die before my eyes. They're so desensitized from what is right, they cannot discern what is wrong. They've been misled since they were born.
This is Hans Gygax with Patrik Os again. We're back talking about the topic of, is it sinful to disallow interracial marriages? Welcome, Patrik.
Yeah, thank you for having me back. It's been a little while.
Yeah, it has. I've had quite a bit going on the property with the homestead and having unplanned surgeries and whatnot. So it's just been a time to focus on children. It's been a good time. We learned about from you biblical covenant family succession, right? Or succession.
Yeah, absolutely. Covenant succession, really cool topic. I was glad to be able to share it with you. And there's some talk that's what we're going to be talking about at the annual gathering that we do. So we'll. I think we've still got some more planning around that, but yeah, we're going to talk about the covenant and covenant succession.
Yeah, maybe we'll do a show on that one time also. So let's get into the topic. We're talking about, is it sinful to disallow interracial marriages? And I guess we'll start off by talking about the common arguments that you would hear from people who think it is actually sinful if we say, sorry that we can't allow our daughter to marry your son because he is not of our people. So they would say this is sinful. What are the reasons why they might say it's sinful?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to people have this idea that we should have unlimited choice unless it is explicitly denied to us in Scripture. So they've taken Christian liberty and expanded it just outwards to every area of life. And so their guiding principle seems to be that if it's not forbidden, it's allowed.
But do they apply it consistently?
No, I really don't think they do. I think there's a lot of talk that could be done about Christian liberty and exactly what is or isn't allowed, but a lot of people want to take the parts that are popular today and say, that's allowed. So it's, I know an argument that you're fond of using, Hans, is that of age. We exclude certain ages from entering into marriages together, and people, under this kind of argument, they would have to say that age is just a number. It doesn't matter if he's 100 and she is 18. That's perfectly allowed, and I don't see how that's a wise standard.
Right. In fact, we actually had a long conversation with the pastor at our church at his family's house, and we were talking to his family, and they had brought up how we shouldn't disallow an interracial marriage. And I challenged them. I said, I spoke directly to their daughter, who is 17, and I said, would you marry a 50-year-old man? And she was just disgusted by it. No, absolutely not. And her father said he would question the motives of a 50-year-old man who would want to marry his daughter. And there were several practical reasons why you wouldn't want your 18-year-old daughter to marry a 50-year-old man, right? We have to use biblical principles in determining that, but the Bible does not explicitly forbid a marriage union that has a 30+ year difference, right?
No, it does not explicitly forbid it. I think there might even be some examples that get kind of close to that disparity in age, but we're also, we're oftentimes shown in the Bible, man's failure, right? Our sinful nature that comes out, by our lack of trust in God's plan. So, when Abraham can't conceive, well, it's just as easy as getting another younger wife. But that doesn't ultimately solve the problem. It doesn't fulfill God's plan. So even though there might be situations where you could even point to some questionable behavior, it just because one of our biblical forefathers has committed this same sin, or maybe even not to say sin, but this unwise action, doesn't mean we should repeat it. We're to use them as examples, not just of their faithfulness, but also of their of their lapses in judgment.
Right. And also, even if somehow you could make it work with that big of an age gap, that wouldn't prove that that should be the standard or the norm. So I don't think you or I argue that every single marriage that isn't based on of the same people group is always 100% of the time sin. In fact, R.J. Rushdoony was very wise in the way he approached the situation. Do you want to read the quote from R.J. Rushdoony on that very instance?
So he said, the answer is there is not a law against it, but there's basically a principle that militates against such marriages, so that you might say they are just barely legal. But in principle, Scripture is opposed to them, because the whole point of marriage is that the wife be a helpmeet to her husband. And the term helpmeet means, in effect, a mirror, an image, one who reflects him spiritually, that is, in terms of faith, in terms of a common background, in terms of a common purpose. Now, marriage between persons of very different races generally doesn't fulfill that requirement, you see. So that it can be technically a marriage, but it isn't one in which the wife can be a helpmeet. So that while it can legally qualify, theologically you could say there are factors which normally, in almost 99 cases out of 100, would militate against it.
So that's R.J. Rushdoony in an audio clip on the law of divorce. And so what we can see from this quote even is that marriages need to have commonality. So you think of, you want to have a very common religion, you want to have a common age, you want to speak a common language, right? You want to be similar to your partner. And so Christians, when they're determining right or wrong for marriage partners, and we're among those who believe that the father has the authority on who his daughter can marry. I know that the church has fallen hard on that issue as well, but as far as not supporting a marriage that's interracial, that falls in the same category as someone who might be opposed to someone being of a very different age than their son or daughter, right?
Right. Or there's even questions of like different religious practices. So there might still be two Christians, but is it healthy for the marriage to bring together I don't know, a Methodist and an Anglican? I mean, it might work out, but the more difficulties that you put in the way of this marriage, the harder a time it's going to have. And yes, of course there's still going to be differences, no matter how similar two people might be. That's another aspect of being a helpmeet. But when when you disagree on such fundamentals, I mean, I think Rushdoony mentioned language as a barrier. You might say to yourself, oh, she and I both, have English in common, but if she, is barely fluent in English, it's going to be difficult for her to communicate. And maybe not with you. Maybe you've learned enough of whatever her language might be that it'll work out. But what about when you are trying to teach your kids, which language is going to be the standard in this household, etc. And these racial differences, yeah, you can overcome them, but you're putting roadblocks in the way of a successful marriage. And so I certainly would never recommend that someone start a marriage off on the wrong foot like that.
Yeah, and it seems that, see, the issue I have with people who would call us sinful for opposing these type of marriages is because they're inconsistent. So you have the age factor that they would say, oh yeah, I'm totally opposed to two different of ages, right?
Yeah.
And then the language one, I mean, even people that are staunch anti-racist, you can hear the frustration they have when they're talking, when they have to call customer service on some product that they bought, and the person on the other end of the line is from India or whatever country, and they can barely speak English, and the communication barrier causes people not to be able to understand each other. And we would argue that race has a very similar factor. Maybe the person that you're marrying can speak very fluent English, yeah, but understanding another person goes much deeper than just your English dialect.
Yeah, precisely. And the thing is, again, these people will say, well, this is sinful, what you're doing by disallowing it. But we know that. I mean, I guess I would have to ask them, do you think that marriages ought to end up in divorce? And I think, of course, most Christians would loudly say no, marriages should not end in divorce. They would either say something between it should be incredibly rare or it should be non-existent. Well, we know that interracial marriages have significantly higher rates of divorce than non-interracial marriages, and likewise with all of these other factors that Rushdoony goes through: language, culture, religion, etc. So, I mean, you are, is it sinful to disallow these people to marry? Well, the question is it maybe causing other sins by allowing them to marry?
Right. And both ourselves and the other Christians who oppose what we're doing, I think both of us agree that factors outside of the question, is he a Christian, is applicable when selecting marriage partners.
Yeah.
Factors outside of explicit scriptural commandments. And you can actually make a decent case from scripture that interracial marriages are, in a sense, forbidden. I mean, you read the book of Ezra, for example, but even if those passages weren't there, even if passages like in Genesis where Abraham said, don't have my son marry any Canaanites, go to my people and my kindred, even if those things weren't there, then you can still draw from other of the same type of principles that these others are drawing upon to come to a conclusion that having an interracial marriage is generally the wrong thing to do, the unwise thing to do, and the unloving thing to do.
Yeah. I certainly wouldn't want my son or daughter to, on their wedding day, all smiles, join into a marriage that's going to be nothing but trouble. Even if it's, even from outside of the marriage itself, just the amount of extra difficulty that comes with it. I couldn't recommend it. And when a marriage starts off on such shaky ground, you're really hoping for a lot to work out right after that. And certainly all marriages are tough and require a lot of prayer and study and cleaving to each other and to God. But when you're creating that many difficulties for something that is supposed to alleviate your burden, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think. I mean, what I don't know what more basic unit of the Christian life is there than your family, and to again have a house divided from the outset is unhealthy.
Absolutely. There's usually the accusation that we hate other races because we are forbidding a marriage, but to me that's an absurd accusation, because I don't hate old people just because I don't want a 70-year-old to marry my daughter. I don't hate that guy. Right? I don't hate the 50-year-old either. I don't hate women because I won't let another woman marry my daughter. I don't hate people that speak other languages because I don't want them to marry my children. In fact, I thought it was interesting that, have you ever seen that Muhammad Ali interview where he was speaking against race mixing? It's a great interview, and in one of the clips he says, "We don't hate you, we just want to stay black," and he makes really good arguments in the interview about staying who they are. And really, when you think about what love and hate actually mean, when you think of the area of child training, right? We talk about in Proverbs 13:24, he that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him. And you will have parents that have been saying it for the last few generations, that they love their children too much to spank them. And the Bible says they actually are hating their child because they're not doing what's best for the child. They're doing what makes them feel better emotionally. And I feel like that's what people that are encouraging interracial marriages are doing. They don't actually love other races. They're trying to fulfill an emotional need. Like, I'm not racist. And they're actually doing harm to the races because they're destroying the races. They're trying to actually eliminate the beautiful diversity that God has created by mixing everything together. So to me, that's not love, that's actually hate. And we're actually the ones that love other races because we're the ones that are not trying to destroy the races.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we were to take every single black person in America and force them into a white mixed marriage, and do this for 2 generations, we would effectively have genocided American blacks by doing this. And is that loving, or is that hateful? I mean, yes, we would have a lot of quadroons running around, but we would have eliminated the black man. Is this a noble purpose? Is this a good thing to do? I certainly, of course, think no, it's not. And you could say, well, it's not because you're forcing these interracial marriages or something to that effect. But I mean, that's part of the problem, is most of these interracial marriages are culturally forced anyway.
Right, through
There's
conditioning.
a lot of natural separation that we have, right? And this is what Muhammad Ali was arguing for. He's not saying that, what's his famous line? Bluebirds with bluebirds and redbirds with redbirds, right? And the beautiful simplicity of it. And it's not that we don't want bluebirds and redbirds to maybe share a tree, but they can't share a nest, and they don't naturally fly with each other. And that's ultimately what we're driving at, is when you start trying to enforce these new strange cultural norms, you're not solving problems, you're creating them. You're taking the easy, the coward's way out, instead of doing the hard work of coming to understand what a nation, a government structure like the United States would look like, with two separate people groups, or now 10 separate people groups, or whatever the case is. Yeah.
What's interesting is that I had a conversation at church with the same family, and this was before we had our much better conversation. But the father of the family told me that all the races should mix into one. And so me, of course, trying to get him to stay consistent, because most people won't stay consistent. And that's the easiest way to destroy an argument, really, is to try to force them to stay consistent. Like with the age factor, they freaked out at the horrific idea of the tremendous age gap, and so it kind of proved the point that they weren't consistent. Well, I said to the father, I said, "Are you saying you hope for a world where there are no more black people?" And he said, "Yeah." He stayed consistent.
Wow.
You had to hand it to him. I don't know if he would admit that in front of a large audience, but to his credit, he at least stayed consistent on that one. But honestly, I don't hope, personally, I don't hate black people enough to hope that they don't exist. But apparently people do hate races enough to want to see them not exist anymore. But then we're called the hateful people, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't know. God clearly has caused races to be different and separate, and trying to erase blackness or whiteness or yellowness, redness, whatever the case is. You are rebelling against God's created order, and nothing good is going to come from that. That's not honoring God. It's not honoring His design. And I'm glad that this man was willing to be consistent in that argument, because maybe it'll kind of open his eyes to what he's actually proposing, which is the elimination of every single distinctive that God intentionally created.
Yeah, and the sad thing is that I guess when I think about it now, he's not so consistent in this manner. He frequently will argue that abortion clinics target blacks and want to see blacks be destroyed, and they think it's this really bad thing. But why is it a bad thing if blacks are erased? Why does it even matter?
Yeah.
I mean, he already told us it doesn't matter if the black race doesn't exist anymore. So why argue on that for the abortion argument?
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair to this guy, I mean, there is a difference between intentionally breeding out blackness and murdering blackness, or whiteness, whatever the case is. But yeah, he's using, and this becomes a very annoying argument that a lot of pro-lifers try to use, which is abortion is evil, and let me show you how it affects blacks. Well, I mean, if we're talking about how evil abortion is, shouldn't we be talking about how evil abortion is? I mean, it's evil no matter who it's done to. It's evil whether it happens to blacks, whites, Asians. It doesn't, that doesn't matter. We're talking about a gross, detestable act, and it's the same kind of act as, again, we're trying to overturn the created order, which is, conception is, life is created from sexual acts, and we are meant to cherish these lives, and we can enjoy them. The pregnancy process, you could really think of it as, I mean, we break it up into trimesters, right? And you can kind of see those same sorts of trios in the rest of life, where you start off very small and helpless. You become more competent and able-bodied before finally aging out into becoming much more reliant upon in that case your children, typically, and that's again something hopefully we'll be able to get to talk about soon. But these people want to overturn the created order. They don't want to. It's all just rebellion against God. They've been tricked. They've been hoodwinked into thinking that they know better than God. And this time they're not eating of the forbidden fruit. Instead, they're just doing this other small thing that, frankly, our betters, our forefathers knew, and we've forgotten.
Yeah, my point's always been that if there's no such thing as different races and it's just skin color, then I don't know why it matters anyway who is being targeted in abortion if everyone is all just the same anyway.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think we'll wrap up on that topic. I think it's obvious that you can't really be consistent if you argue that it's hateful and sinful for a Christian to use race as a factor in determining marriage, any more than you could argue that it's hateful or sinful to argue on the basis of age or language or other types of factors.
They just don't understand the meaning of it all. They've been lied to for so long by the God